we're also fortunate enough to have our second speaker, Oliver Villar, from the Charles Sturt University and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Oliver is also an author, and this presentation will look at the context in which the Cuban Revolution occurred and its powerful influence on Latin America, and in particular Colombia, and the anti-imperialist struggles. Folks, and then after that we'll move to discussion. Can you please make him feel welcome? Oliver Villar.
First of all, I'd like to just thank the organisers for inviting me here. I'm flattered. Also everyone here for coming to listen to what I have to say. I guess I could start by saying that I've been, the process of a number of years, I've been spending a lot of time looking at the security situation in Latin America, and particularly Colombia, which many analysts are comparing with the security situation in the Middle East as a comparison with Israel. So from a security studies background, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what I call the great struggle that we face in Latin America and 21st century imperialism. So where do we start? There are about 58,000 doctors and teachers working in poor communities outside of Cuba, with thousands of foreigners studying with medicine within. In the past, Cuba sent over 350,000 soldiers to Angola to fight the racist South African regime. Between 61 and 1968, La Isla de Juventud in Cuba trained guerrillas from Vietnam, Africa, Central America, and South America. What I'm saying is Cuban foreign policy was aligned with supporting revolutionary struggles in the Third World, but up until now there's been a solid commitment to education and also medicine, which is quite profound and impressive. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba, and with a correlation of military forces against it, this tiny island has continued to provide education and health programs around the world, including East Timor, which has been quite well documented. But in a post-Cold War context, Cuban internationalism has meant that revolutionary struggles that were formerly receiving financial and military assistance from the Soviet bloc, as well as Cuban training, no longer do. I think, again, going back to this classic case, Colombia, this is quite a sharp example to be made, where since 1948, state terrorism has targeted leftists, peasants and unionists, giving rise to the world's oldest Marxist insurgency led by the Colombian Communist Party and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, who continue to wage this struggle against the Colombian state. So despite the Cold War over, there's a new struggle, a great struggle, which continues, which more or less does have some similar characteristics of the Cold War. Most recently, La Marcha Patriótica, which is a mass movement comprising of hundreds of thousands of poor Colombians, unemployed, peasants and unionists, are demanding an end to the Colombian oligarchy that have ruled Colombia with an iron fist for centuries, dating back perhaps to the Spanish conquest. But as in Colombia and across Latin America, revolutionaries do look towards the Cuban Revolution as a source of inspiration. Arguably, the most significant contemporary internationalist contribution of the Cuban Revolution has been its survival. Since the 1990s, this significance has been Cuba's counterexample to neoliberal imperialism, or what we hear as it's being advertised as globalization. In 1991, in the wake of the collapse of the socialist bloc, Fidel Castro stated, quote, "Now internationalism means defending and preserving the Cuban Revolution. To defend this trench, this bastion of socialism, is the greatest service we can offer to humanity." But just as the Russian and later Chinese Revolution triggered revolutionary struggles across Europe and the Third World, the Cuban Revolution has been an objective force against US and Western imperialism, but I would say in different ways, particularly in the contemporary context. Today it's been an active force in waging ideological and political struggle against imperialism. Cuba launched a series of initiatives in the mid-1990s challenging the present world economic and political order. And across Latin America, neoliberal regimes were overthrown with hundreds killed by state and police forces. And this was quite an achievement in the way since the 1990s there's been a left tide emerging in Latin America. In Colombia and in Central America, however, state terrorism continues to murder thousands of patriotic forces, victims of capitalism and imperialism under the aegis of the war on drugs or the war on terror. Colombia has broken Guatemala's Cold War record of 200,000 murdered in the hands of US-backed security forces. More than 250,000 leftists have disappeared, or as we once said in Argentina, desaparecidos. And this has been since the Colombian presidency of Álvaro Uribe Vélez. Hundreds of thousands more are believed to be unaccounted for with the use of Nazi-style crematories. This is according to latest journalistic reports and also WikiLeaks sources. There are approximately 10,000 political prisoners in Colombia, and it continues to be the murder capital of the world for trade unionists. Approximately 5 million refugees displaced internally we see in Colombia, and this is perhaps the highest in the world, only on par with Sudan. Since the 1990s, the Cuban government, various mass organisations and professional associations have convened in numerous international forums to discuss, debate and oppose the consequences of neoliberal imperialism, or what I would call 21st century imperialism. Thousands of Cuban internacionalistas now working in, for example, Venezuela and Bolivia, especially in areas of health and education, have not only made a crucial contribution to Venezuelan and Bolivian social development, but also critically in the revolutionary consciousness that's been so essential to these advances that's been made in these countries. From an imperialist perspective, the main arguments of various US presidencies, from dating back to Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and George Bush Sr. against the Cuban Revolution were its close relations with the Soviet Union and its support for liberation movements. Since the end of the Cold War, the conditions, dating at least back to the Carter administration, set by Clinton, George W. Bush and Obama, for recognising the Cuban government and for lifting this age-old economic blockade, has been the establishment of a Western-style democracy in Cuba and respect for human rights. That's the imperialist argument. These are the conditions that Washington sets. In the 1990s, the US passed two extraterritorial laws to reinforce the blockade: the Torricelli Act of 92 and the Helms-Burton Act of 96. Neither of these laws, however, have achieved its purpose of isolating Cuba, although they managed to increase the price of imported goods, further pushing Cuba to adapt to 21st century economic realities, or 21st century imperialism. New laws, highly debated in Cuba, now allow surplus value for individuals. In 2009, only the United States and Israel and Palau voted in the UN General Assembly against lifting the embargo, while Micronesia and the Marshall Islands abstained. In 1996, the European Union adopted a policy called the Common Position, associated with the Aznar government in Spain, subordinating European policy towards Cuba with US imperialism. So the island is not isolated, it has a solid position in the international arena, and we have to thank Fidel for these achievements, and of course the Cuban Revolution. What allows this are relations also with Venezuela and member countries of the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, or ALBA, as well as growing relations with Brazil and Mercosur countries, strong relations with China, Russia and several Arab and African countries, traditional relations with Spain and Mexico, and also relations with developed capitalist countries. Also, the emergence of radical governments developing alternatives to neoliberalism in Venezuela, Nicaragua, as we've seen in some of these clips, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and El Salvador, has made Cuba an influential voice in the region. Its principal strategic allies are Venezuela and the ALBA countries, and existing agreements with Venezuela have been extended and also strengthened. Global strategic allies are China, Vietnam, North Korea and Russia, relations with Spain and the Vatican remain high profile. Internationally, Cuba supports the Palestinian cause and has strengthened relations with the Middle East, including Iran. Cuba today is not a threat as an ally of the former Soviet Union and is not involved in previous theatres of operations, as in Central America and Africa. But as both Fidel and as Raúl has been aware since the 1990s, Cuban socialism is neither irreversible nor significantly advancing, despite important victories by leftist governments in Latin America in recent years. I would have to say there are two pressing issues which the Cuban revolution now faces, at least from a security standpoint, and also with some political economy approaches to the question. These are increasing incorporation into the international and regional economy, and or defending the gains of the Cuban socialism. Whether this is possible to do both, one incorporating itself further in order to adapt to new realities, as well as defending Cuban socialism, is open to debate, whether both are possible. What we do know, however, is that Raúl is a supporter of the Chinese model, which has raised debate amongst many academic quarters. Chavez views Fidel as a mentor, and with respect to the mass struggles in Colombia, Fidel has pressured Chavez, at least this is what we know, to take the stance they are taking towards the insurgency, which is not to support the armed struggle openly, but to recognise it as a belligerent force. Although in the past, Fidel, and most certainly Che, would have supported armed struggle quite openly, Fidel is, I think, taking a strategic decision by looking at the broader centre-left governments in economic alliance with China, which adopt a kind of national capitalism. But I think the question I pose at the forum is Latin America China or the European Union? Can imperialism be tamed or accommodated in a 21st century context? When compared to previous years, the big challenge for leftist governments and Cuba now is that the Latin American left face a more difficult situation, which have been well documented. These include rampant corruption by CIA-backed opposition groups, muscling into parliamentary processes, and the same groups operating freely terrorising civilian life, as we hear in Venezuela and Bolivia, and of course the use of death squads, as in Colombia and Central America. This does pose real dangers for the advances made by the Latin American left. Advocates of Fidel point to a mass redistribution of wealth and a recovery of sovereignty as indicators that they are on the right path. What is not debated amongst the Latin American left, and by the left abroad, however, is whether there is a greater strategic plan for defending all of these leftist governments and the socialist achievements that have been achieved so far, and whether or not some of these governments could meet the same fate as Zelaya, or as we've seen recently in Paraguay, or even Gaddafi or Assad. Saying that, can the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela outmaneuver US imperialism and its proxy state of Colombia? If we recall, since 2008, US imperialism has used, through billions of dollars of funding, in a way to check and also counter response to these developments. In the spirit of Che, Martí, in Bolivar, and as a supporter of the Cuban Revolution, I recognise Fidel Castro as one of the great revolutionary leaders of our time. I think there's no better way to pay tribute to his contributions, and by defending them and by speaking plainly about, I think, is the great struggle that we face in Latin America. Viva Cuba, viva Fidel, hasta la victoria siempre.
Thank you to our second speaker, Villar.